scientists, researchers and so on marching in the streets was the question?
Well, first of all, Tony, I think scientists are actually steel magnolias, not precious petals. So it's just that we're working differently. We are working behind the scenes. We're trying to use persuasion. We're speaking to you tonight, the Australian people, to persuade you of the importance of science and science education for the future of this country. And we know that the politicians will be listening to us. Our leaders will be listening.
You're watching The World from Below, and that was a clip of molecular biologist Suzanne Corey talking about the reactions of the Australian science community to this year's federal budget. We're speaking with Nobel Prize winner Professor Peter Doherty about Ebola and the state of science funding in Australia. The government currently provides around 60% of the CSIRO's $750 million funding. In the May budget, the government cut $111 million over 4 years from the organisation at a cost of 500 jobs. The CSIRO announced recently that it will cut the number of infectious disease researchers at the Australian Animal Health Laboratory in Geelong, which studies diseases such as Ebola. Professor Doherty, you've described the Australian Animal Health Laboratory as a major international centre for research. What impact do you expect these funding cuts to have on the laboratory?
As far as the lab's concerned, I've talked to them about it. They don't think they're going to have a major impact, but they have lost some people. The way to come back on that really would be as if we can put more people from other funded sources. And of course, if we get this medical research fund up, which Peter Doherty said, even if the co-payment, which is highly unpopular, of course, and seems rather an odd way to do it, even if that doesn't go through, they're still thinking of trying to put it forward. So it may be that we can get more resources and more personnel in there by other mechanisms. I mean, the CSIRO mechanism is one particular way of doing things, but there are other ways of doing things as well.
It does seem a bad time to be cutting funding to something like this, which I think you've described it as a global resource, really.
Well, they came in with a kind of shock and awe budget, and as you know, some of that stuff they could get through, like the science funding and so forth, because there wasn't a need to go to the Parliament for it, as I understand it, but others they've been quite blocked. And so it's been probably a pretty frustrating time for them, I expect. They've also been on a very steep learning curve. I've been concerned by the cuts to science, and I've actually commented fairly negatively on it. But hopefully they're learning something as we're learning something, and things will get a bit more positive in the future.
We were talking in the last segment about bioterrorism, but you actually have written that nature is our worst bioterrorist and that humanity is constantly challenged by novel zoonotic viruses like Ebola. So I assume you don't think Ebola is necessarily going to be the last of these kinds of
No, it
epidemics.
certainly won't. And Ebola wasn't novel. We've known about it since 1976. And we've known it's a potential threat. We just thought we'd handle it better than we actually did. And we fell down. I mean, basically didn't do the job well. But I think we need to think about this now very seriously. We need to think about it both from in terms of natural threats, possible bioterror threats, because we're getting into a rather strange world. And I think we need to start looking at the major groups of viruses that are potential threats. And you can think of the SARS-like viruses, the MERS-like viruses, which are related to SARS and are circulating in the Middle East. And we should think about preparing antiviral drugs against them. Viruses aren't like bacteria. There aren't a lot of generic broad spectrum drugs. You generally need to target the virus itself, though you can target often across a whole group of viruses that are related. So I think we should be preparing those drugs. We should be thinking about vaccines and getting those prepared and getting them all ready to go. Don't stockpile them, but get them through the tests and get them ready to go. Now that's going to take some resources, but I think the resources might be there, not necessarily from the Australian government, though I think they can put some of that in. And I think if it's an international competition, we've got a lot of skills here that could be used and could help in that effort.
It's interesting you're talking about skills in Australia's, I guess, what might be called a comparative advantage in science research. Prime Minister Tony Abbott did choose not to include a science minister in his cabinet last year, and it's the first time it's happened, I think, since 1931. What do you make of a decision like that?
I wasn't awfully upset about it. I think what you need for science is a strong minister who's an advocate. We certainly had a very strong minister who was a strong advocate in the previous government, in Kim Carr. Macfarlane, it's a bit hard to know. I mean, it's not quite such an open discussion, I think. I do think he's a decent guy and that he's well motivated. So you can have a science minister, but the science minister is often a junior minister. They're not in the cabinet, and they can be a very convenient whipping boy. And you can put them out there as being spokesmen for science, but they have no real power. And that's been done in the past. I mean, you know, politics at times, I mean, this is a surprise, no doubt, but it can be a little cynical.
Can you tell me, as well as research, there's also the issue of science education, and I read that the average 15-year-old in Australia is now nearly 2 years behind their peers in China when it comes to school science. What do you make of the state of science education in Australia?
I think it's got a way to, it's not doing fantastically well, but I think part of the problem is that the kids look at science and they don't see any jobs. So we're getting a lot of good people into the science faculty at the University of Melbourne, but we've gone to this Melbourne model where if you want to go to medical school or vet school or dental school, you have to go through basically the science faculty first. So we're getting a lot of bright young kids coming into it, and some of those will defect and go straight into science. Some will go into areas like medicine and then come back and do science because they'll find that it's not satisfying for them to be, say, a suburban general practitioner, and they want to do something a bit more intense. Not that that's not a great life, it is, but it doesn't suit everybody. So I'm not as obsessed or upset about that. I'm concerned about mathematics and physics, but then I think we've got wonderful figures out there like Brian Cox who are firing kids up to be much more interested in physics. And I'd like to make sure that those kinds of TV programs and YouTube clips and so forth are available and the kids are looking at them.
So, do you think more generally, do you think a lower scientific education through schooling contributes to poorer scientific debate when it comes to public debates? I'm thinking of something like climate change, where we have a scientific consensus pretty much, and yet that is not reflected in the public discussion about the topic.
Well, there's a lot of confusion in that area, and there have been people who've been deliberately muddying the waters, of course. And it's also, as Al Gore said in his book, it's very inconvenient. And so people, but on the whole, we see the uptake of solar power and so forth. There's quite a movement in the community to say this is serious and we need to do something about it. Also, I'm reading some of the newspapers, you read that there are many people in the business community who are very concerned, not presumably in the mining area, but in other business, and really think we should be moving ahead with some form of carbon pricing scheme because that's inevitably going to hit them sometime. The problem with the whole thing is if you sort of deny the reality of it, you're going to invest in the wrong things, you're going to take the country in the wrong direction.
Or have uncertainty.
And you actually may end up being not well regarded internationally. I mean, the climate scientists are talking about an increase in temperature by the end of the century have been between 1.7 and 5.4 in mean temperature. Now that shows you how hard it is to predict this stuff, that they've got such a big range. But if that goes badly, then countries that have made their living selling coal and fossil fuels are not going to be well regarded internationally, and I don't think we want to get into that position.
No. Okay, we're going to take another quick break, but we'll be back further to discuss birds and how they influence the environment and the environment influences them. Stay with us.